was a simple trip. I just needed to rest one night before heading to another city. I didn't want to spend too much, so I looked for a cheap hotel nearby. After a few minutes of driving, I found a small hotel with an old but well-maintained facade. The illuminated sign blinked a few times, and the reception seemed empty. I parked, rang the doorbell, and waited. A tired-looking man appeared behind the counter. His uniform looked old-fashioned, as if it belonged to another time. "A room for one night, please." He nodded, without saying anything, and handed me a silver key. The number was 306. I took the key and went up the narrow corridor. The smell of old wood and mold hung in the air, but nothing that bothered me. Upon entering the room, I realized that it was simple but comfortable. An iron bed, a desk, and an antique mirror in the corner. I threw myself on the bed, exhausted. It was then that I saw it. In the mirror's reflection, the bed was empty. I looked at myself, touched my leg, my face. I was there, but in the reflection, there was no one. Dread paralyzed me for a few seconds. I looked in the mirror, then at the door. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my backpack and ran out. At the reception, the old attendant was no longer there. The bell on the counter looked dusty, as if no one had rung it in years. I hurried out, got in the car, and sped off without looking back. The next day, I decided to check the location using the map on my cell phone. There was no hotel there, just an empty lot. But what scares me the most to this day is what happened when I reviewed the photos on my cell phone that night. Among the images that I didn't even remember taking, there was one of the bedroom, the empty bed. I never liked cutting corners at night. Deserted and poorly lit streets give me chills. But that day, tiredness spoke louder. Work had gone on longer than expected, and I just wanted to get home and rest. The shortest route passed through a forgotten street, with few houses and poor lighting. As I walked down the dark street, my footsteps echoed in the silence of the night. Suddenly, my eyes were drawn to a house that seemed to clash with the rest of the neighborhood. Its structure was crooked, as if time had bent it. The windows were wide open, and even in the darkness, there seemed to be someone inside. I tried to ignore it and keep walking, but curiosity got the better of me. When I passed in front of the gate, I heard a noise coming from inside. A cry, low and dragging. I stopped. The sound sounded like a child crying. I looked inside and saw a silhouette on the second floor, standing at the window. Small, with her back to me. My heart raced. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I moved away a little and looked around. The street was completely empty. There was no movement in the other houses. Then, the silhouette slowly turned around. It had no face, just smooth skin like a wax mask. A scream caught in the throat. My feet ran without me being able to control them. The crying continued, but now it seemed closer and closer. My footsteps echoed down the deserted street, and the feeling of something behind me was unbearable. When I finally got home and locked the door, my body was still shaking. The image of the faceless silhouette never left my head. The next day, I went to ask a neighbor about that house. He looked at me confused. "What house?" I asked him to accompany me there. But when we arrived at the crossroads, there was nothing, just an empty plot of land, overgrown with bushes. The neighbor looked at me suspiciously, as if I were making up a story. I insisted that the house was there the night before, but he denied it. I returned home intrigued. Had I imagined everything? But the feeling of having seen something real was very strong. That night, I decided to go back to the dark street. I wanted to make sure the house didn't exist. As I walked down the street, fear slowly invaded me. With each step, the feeling of being watched increased. When I reached the crossroads, I stopped. The house wasn't there, but suddenly I heard crying again. He seemed to come out of nowhere. I looked around and saw a shadow on the ground. The shadow moved, as if it were dancing. Suddenly, the shadow turned into the faceless silhouette. She was standing in front of me, staring at me. I screamed and ran home. I locked the door and locked myself in the room. That night, I couldn't sleep. The crying and the image of the silhouette haunted me throughout the night. The next day, I decided to find out more about the history of that street. I discovered that many years ago, a family had lived in a house on that land. The family was known for practicing strange rituals and secret cults. Terrified, I realized that the house I had seen was the family home, and that the faceless silhouette was the spirit of a child who had been sacrificed in one of the rituals. I decided I needed to move away. But before I went, I returned to the dark street once more. I wanted to make sure the house was still there. When I reached the crossroads, the house was there, crooked, dark, and scary. I felt a shiver down my spine. The faceless silhouette was in the window, watching me. I ran away from there, without looking back. I moved in the next day, but the feeling of being watched never left me. And every now and then, when I walk through deserted streets at night, I hear the child crying, and I know the house is still there, waiting for me. I've always been fascinated by abandoned places, not for fun, but out of morbid curiosity. In the city where I live, there was a commercial building that had been languishing for years. The broken windows, the corroded sign, and the locked doors turned it into an urban specter. What intrigued me was one detail, a muffled sound, like a sigh, that emanated from inside the building. No matter the season, the sound persisted. Intrigued, I decided to investigate. I started to observe the building from afar. I noticed that the curtains on some windows were moving on their own, as if someone was spying on them. A shiver ran down my spine. That night, I dreamed about the building. In it, I wandered through endless corridors, opening doors that took me to the same starting point. As I looked out the window, I saw myself standing across the street, watching myself. I woke up with a start, with the feeling of being watched. The building had become an obsession. I could no longer walk past him without feeling a chill. I decided to investigate the history of the building. I discovered that it had been the scene of a tragedy many years ago. A fire resulted in the tragedy of several employees. The survivors were never the same, and the building was abandoned. The tragedy left me even more disturbed. Could it be that the sound I heard was a lament from the spirits? A week later, a group of young people disappeared after trying to break into the building. The police investigated, but found no clues. The mystery deepened. One night, I decided to go back to the building. Curiosity was stronger than fear. Armed with a flashlight, I entered the building. The silence was sepulchral. The air is heavy. With each step, the creaking of wood and the echo of my footsteps increased the feeling of dread. I walked through the corridors, now deserted, but with remnants of a prosperous past. I found documents, photos, and personal objects. It was as if time had stopped. Suddenly, a noise scared me. A whisper. I felt a presence. A shiver ran through my body. I quickened my pace, trying to run away, but I tripped and fell. The flashlight went out, leaving me in darkness. The whispering intensified, accompanied by moans. I got up, shaky, and ran to the exit. I tripped again, falling onto something hard. I turned on the flashlight and saw a figure standing next to me. He looked at me and disappeared. I screamed, terrified, and ran out of the building without looking back. I never went back to the building. The police cordoned off the location, but the mystery remains. The muffled sound has stopped, but fear haunts me. Sometimes I wonder if what happened in the building was real or a figment of my imagination. But the image of the figure staring at me haunts me, telling me that the terror is real. The building is still there, imposing and ghostly, guarding its secrets. And I, with the certainty that I will never approach him again. I've always been fascinated by haunting stories. When I saw an ad for a cheap apartment in the city center, I couldn't resist. The building was old, with an exposed brick facade and wooden windows. The apartment itself was small, but seemed well maintained. On the very first night, I started hearing low whispers, as if someone was talking on the other side of the wall. However, the apartment next door was empty. At first, I ignored the whispers, but over time they became more frequent and clearer. One night, I decided to record the sound. The next day, when I listened to the recording, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The recording clearly captured my calm breathing, but in the background there was another breath, heavy and drawn out. Intrigued, I called the property manager to ask about the apartment's history. He hesitated for a moment and then told me that, years ago, that room had been sealed. The space that was now my room was previously part of another apartment. And the most disturbing detail, no one ever knew why they decided to close that space. The property manager told me that the previous resident of the apartment next door was a mysterious and lonely man. He disappeared without a trace, and the apartment sat empty for years. I moved out the next day, but before leaving, I recorded it one more time. Last night, for the first time, I managed to understand one of the whispers. It was a single word, said clearly before the audio ended. Stay. The word paralyzed me. I felt a chill down my spine and a feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment. That night I had a terrible nightmare. I was in the apartment, lying in bed. Suddenly, the bedroom door opened and a shadowy figure appeared. The figure approached the bed and whispered, "You're not getting out of here." I woke up with a start, my heart racing. I looked into the room and saw that the door was open. I decided to investigate the previous resident of the apartment next door. I discovered he was a man named Thomas. He was obsessed with the occult and macabre rituals. One night, I found a diary in the apartment. The diary contained notes on rituals and invocations of demonic entities. In one of the notes, Thomas described a ritual to imprison souls in the world of the living. The ritual required an animal sacrifice. Terrified, I realized that the whispers I heard were the souls trapped in the apartment. I decided I needed to free souls. But to do so, you would need to perform the opposite ritual. The next night, I returned to the apartment with a group of friends. We prepared the ritual and began to invoke the souls. Suddenly, the lights went out and the apartment was plunged into darkness. A cold wind invaded the room and the whispers intensified. The walls began to creak and objects fell to the floor. A shadowy figure appeared in the corner of the room. The figure approached us and tried to attack us. We fought against it, but the figure was too strong. Suddenly, a sharp scream echoed in the room. One of my friends had been attacked by the figure. Desperate, I continued the ritual. The souls began to break free and the shadowy figure disappeared. The next day, the apartment was empty. The souls had been freed. I never went back to the apartment again, but the experience marked me forever. I believe the apartment still holds dark secrets, and that Thomas is still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. In my neighborhood, there was a house that looked like it had been plucked from another time. It clashed among the modern buildings, with their ancient architecture and neglected garden. The windows were always covered with heavy curtains, and the peeling paint gave the impression that the house was abandoned. Intrigued, I asked an older neighbor about the house. He frowned and asked, "What house?" I found the question strange, but he seemed sincere. I decided to take a photo of the house to show my neighbor, but the next day, when I went to check the image on my cell phone, there was only an empty space between the buildings. From that day on, I began to observe the house more closely. I tried to understand why she appeared and disappeared, until one night I saw lights flashing in the windows. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and, with a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to get closer. As I approached, the wind began to blow more strongly, and the leaves on the trees seemed to rustle. When I got close to the door, I felt intense cold and a musty smell. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity took over. I opened the door and entered the house. The silence was deafening. Dust covered the old furniture, and the walls were peeling. The house seemed to have been frozen in time. Suddenly, I heard a noise upstairs, a creak of wood. My heart raced. I felt like I wasn't alone in the house. I climbed the stairs carefully, each step echoing in the silence. I reached the top floor and saw a long, dark hallway. The bedroom doors were closed. I began to slowly open the doors, one room at a time. Each room had a different appearance, but they all had something in common: dust and abandonment. In one of the rooms, I found an antique mirror. As I got closer, I saw my reflection distorted, as if I was aging before my eyes. Startled, I turned away from the mirror and continued to explore the house. In another room, I found a diary. I started reading and discovered that the house belonged to a family that had disappeared many years ago. The family was known for practicing strange rituals and secret cults. The diary told of a ritual that allowed the spirits of the dead to remain in the world of the living. The ritual required a human sacrifice. I was horrified by reading the diary. I realized that the house was not abandoned. The family spirits were still there. Suddenly, I heard a whisper in my ear. A cold, hoarse voice. "You shouldn't be here," said the voice. I turned around and saw a shadowy figure in the hallway. The figure approached me, and I tried to run away, but the door was gone. I was trapped in the house. The figure got even closer, and I felt paralyzing fear. The figure reached out and touched me. The next morning, I woke up in my room as if nothing had happened. But the house wouldn't leave my head. I knew she was still there, somewhere, waiting for someone else to notice her presence. And now, when I pass certain places, I have this strange feeling that if I look fast enough, I might see her again. The Ghost House. On the quiet Rua das Sombras, there was a house that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Its once elegant facade now showed the wear and tear of the years, with dusty windows and a wild garden that seemed to want to swallow the building. Intrigued, a young man named Lucas, who had recently moved to the neighborhood, decided to explore the abandoned house. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured into the dusty rooms, where the silence was interrupted only by the rustling of dry leaves and the creaking of loose boards. In the basement, Lucas found an old locked trunk. Curious, he forced the lock and opened the chest, revealing a diary yellowed with age. The diary pages contained accounts of a family who had lived in the house decades ago. The once prosperous family had been beset by a series of tragic events: illnesses, disappearances, and rumors of macabre rituals. As Lucas delved deeper into his reading, the atmosphere in the house became heavier. He heard whispers, shadows danced across his field of vision, and the feeling of not being alone intensified with each page he turned. In one of the rooms, Lucas found an old mirror. As he got closer, he saw his reflection distort, aging and decomposing in a matter of seconds. A shiver ran down his spine, and he turned away from the mirror, fearing what might happen. Suddenly, Lucas' flashlight went out, leaving him in total darkness. He heard footsteps upstairs and a voice whispering his name. Fear took over Lucas, who ran out of the house, without looking back. In the following days, Lucas tried to forget what had happened, but the house and its secrets haunted him in his dreams. He decided to investigate the family's history and discovered that the residents of the street avoided the house, fearing that it was cursed. Lucas returned to the house, this time accompanied by a friend. Together, they explored the place, but found nothing unusual. However, Lucas felt that the house hid something more, something that could not be seen or touched. One night, Lucas woke up to a whisper in his ear. "You are not alone." He turned around and saw the shadow of a figure in the corner of the room. The figure approached, revealing the face of a child, pale and with empty eyes. Lucas screamed and sat up in bed, scared. He realized that the house would not leave him alone until its secrets were revealed. With his friend's help, Lucas began researching ancient rituals and spiritual entities. They discovered that the family in the house had performed a ritual to summon an evil spirit, but the ritual went wrong, and the spirit became trapped in the house, feeding on the energy of the living. Lucas and his friend decided to perform a counter-ritual to free the spirit and end the curse on the house. They returned to the house, prepared to face the terror that awaited them. In the basement, they found the ritual site, marked by strange symbols and bloodstains. While they were preparing the counter-ritual, the spirit manifested itself, attacking them violently. After a tense fight, Lucas and his friend managed to complete the counter-ritual. The spirit was released, and the house seemed to calm down. Lucas and his friend left the house, exhausted but relieved. They knew the house would never be the same again, but they hoped its secrets had finally been revealed. The Street of Shadows has once again become a peaceful place, but the story of the abandoned house has become a legend, told from generation to generation, as a reminder that fear can hide in the most unexpected places.